Okay, Rabbi Sai, let's get started. We're at the DAF YOMI, DAF Kuf Zayin Amid Aleph. It's about a third way down on the page. We were talking about yesterday about the requirements of a kosher vessel to do Netilas Yadayim. And Rava had told us yesterday that in order for the vessel to be kosher for Netilas Yadayim, it can't have any leaks or holes in it. It has to be able to hold the water without it leaking out. And now we're up to another statement of Rava, Ve'amar Rava. It's about literally a third way down on the page. Ve'amar Rava, Kli she'ein bo revius, ein notlin mimeno liyadayim. That if the vessel does not have a revius of water, which is approximately 3.3 ounces, if it doesn't have that amount of water, then you cannot use it for netilas yadayim. Eini, is this really so? The ha'amar Rava kli she'ein machzik revius ein notlin mimeno liyadayim. Ha'machzik afal gav de lesbe. But Rava was quoted in another place stating that the vessel has to be able to hold a revius, which implies that even if there's not a revius of water, as long as the vessel can contain a revius, that is sufficient. So how do you reconcile it with the other statement of Rava that you have to have a revius of water? Lo kasha halachad halatrei, the Tanya may revius notlin liyadayim le'echad va'afilu l'shnayim. So the Gemara answers it's not a contradiction. As we're going to see, you need to start with the revius of water. You always must start with the revius of water. But let's say, and you have to have a utensil that can hold a revius, plus it has to have a revius of water. But you can actually use that water to wash not only one person's hand, but a second person's hand. So let's say you use only half a revius for the first person. You can use the second half of the revius for the second person. The requirement, however, is that you have to have a requisite amount before you start the Netilas Yadayim process, and therefore that amount has to be a revius. So when Rava says you have to have a revius, it means starting off before you wash that one person or two persons' hands. But when he says the utensil has to hold a revius, which implies that you can use less than a revius, that's referring to the second person. By the time you're ready to wash the second person's hand, you have less than a revius, and that's still okay. Amrle Rav Sheshis la'amem ar kapdisu amana amrle in. So Rav Sheshis was schmoozing with Amemar, and he says, are you makpid on the intactness and size of the kli? And he said yes, meaning that this is something that we are very careful and meticulous about. Achazusa amrle in. Are you meticulous about the water requiring to have the appearance of water, meaning that it can't be murky or be colored in any way? And he said yes. Ashiura, are you concerned about the requirement of having a requisite amount of water? Amarle in. And he said yes. Ika da amri hachi amarle amana va'achazusa kabdinan ashiura lo kabdinan. Some say that Amemar's response was, on the first two, we are careful. We're makpid to make sure that the kli holds a revius and is intact, and we're makpid that the water should have the appearance of water. But to require us to have all the time a revius of water, we're not so makpid, because the Tanya may revius notlin liyadayim le'echad va'afilu l'shnayim. As the Brisa says, that when you wash the hands, you can use one revius for one person and even two people. Velohi. But that actually, in the final analysis, is not a correct statement to say that we don't care at all that you have to have a revius, because shayni hasam mishum dekasum mishiyarei tahara. In other words, everyone agrees that you must have a requisite amount of water. But when you have the requisite revius of water, you can use it not only for one person, but you can use it for two people. But if you start with less than a revius, everyone agrees that that would be invalid. And like Rashi explains, what the words deka'asi mishiyarei tahara means is that as long as you started with a purifying amount, which is a revius, if you use only a portion of that water, you can use a remnant of that purifying water. But if you have less than a revius, it's no longer called purifying water, and therefore it's not usable even for one person. Askin Rav Yaakov minahar pikod not labas reviasa. Askin Rav Ashi behutzal kuza bas reviasa. And the Gemara just tells us that these are two sages who who wanted to educate the public. So they had manufactured for them a container that held exactly a revius so that everyone could use that as their marker to determine how much water they needed. And so Rav Yaakov from Nahar Pekod manufactured a glass utensil, and Rav Ashi of Hutzal manufactured an earthenware utensil, or a pottery utensil. V'amar Rava, magufas chavesh shetikna nolin mimenu liyadayim. Now here's another chiddush of Rava, and he says that, the kli that we require, we said it has to be intact, it has to hold a revius. What if it was initially manufactured not to be a receptacle? What do I mean by that? Let's say you have a barrel stopper. You know what it could be made out of cork, it could be made out of wood. It's used to stop up the spigot. Let's say it's a very large hole and it's a very large stopper. And let's say I decide I'm going to drill a hole and bore out a hole in the stopper and use it now as a container. That container can be used for netilas yadayim. In other words, you don't need the utensil to initially have been manufactured for that purpose. As long as it's usable as a container, you can use it for netilas yadayim. Tanya nami hachi magufas chavesh shetikna nolin mimenu liyadayim, and that's exactly what the Brisa says. Another statement is chemes uchafisha shetikna nolin mehen liyadayim sak v'kup afal pisha mekablin ein nolin mehen liyadayim. So the Brisa continues and it says that if you have different kinds of leather flasks, as long as they can contain a revius, they can be used for netilas yadayim. However, a sack and a box, which are made out of materials that are normally porous and are not meant to hold liquid, those cannot be used for netilas yadayim. Now, ibayelahu mahu le'echol b'mapa. Now a totally different question. Now that we've established the importance of netilas yadayim, let's ask the following shaila. What happens if a person prefers not to wash his hands for any reason? Water's not easily available, whatever. Can he wrap his hands in cloth to create a barrier between his hands and the food such that his hands won't directly touch the food? Let's say he wants to put on gloves, or let's say like we do when you're on the plane and it's not readily available to wash, you keep the sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil or plastic and you make hamotzi without washing. So we're familiar with that halacha from experience, but this is really the sugya. Can you do that? The Gemara is asking, wrap your hands in cloth so that you're not touching the food directly. So do you say, michayshin dilma naga olo? Are we worried that you may inadvertently touch it with your hand even though you've wrapped your hand or the food? Or are we not worried? So tashma, ucheshenasnu lo l'Reb Tzadok ochel pachos mikabetza not lo b'mapa va'ochlo chutz l'sukkah ve'in mevarech acharav. So look at the following story. There was a Tana named Reb Tzadok, and it was Sukkos one day, and they gave him food that was less than the size of a kibetza, of an egg, and based on that, he ate it outside the sukkah, and he didn't make a bracha achrona on it because he felt that you only have to bench after you eat a kazayas worth of food. But what's important here is that he also didn't have water for netilas yadayim. So what did he do instead? He wrapped his hands in cloth and ate the bread that way. So what do we want to infer from here? My lav hakabetza boy netilas yadayim. So maybe the only reason why Reb Tzadok was prepared to do that was because it was an insignificant amount of food. But perhaps if we can infer that if it's a significant amount of food, wrapping your hands in cloth should not be acceptable. So the Gemara says, no, maybe that's the wrong inference. Dilma hakabetza boy sukkah boy bracha. Maybe wrapping your hands will work no matter how much food you're going to eat. But the reason why is specifically in that case he was eating less than a kibetza worth of food was because of the consideration of eating outside the sukkah and the consideration of not benching afterwards. But maybe that's the size of the food that he was eating has no bearing on the law that you're allowed to wrap your hands unconditionally. So Tashma, okay, so let's look at another source to prove our point one way or the other. We've established that at least for less than a kibetza, you can wrap your hands, and it's ambiguous whether that'll work for larger than a kibetza. Let's look at something else. The Shmuel ashkechei l'Rav de ka'achel b'mapa. There was a story once that Shmuel encountered Rav eating a sandwich with his hands wrapped. So Amar Le Avdin Kedain. So he said, or Avdin Kedin. He says, are you really acting properly? Is that what we're permitted to do? V'chi osin kain, like Rashi says, or is this? Are we allowed to do this? I'm astonished that you should be allowed to do this because I assume that you're not allowed to do this without washing. So Amar Le Daiti Katzra Alai. So Rav said, of course I wouldn't do this normally. I washed already. I washed my hands for Netilas Yadayim. So then why are your hands wrapped? He said, I'm fastidious. I'm a finicky eater. I'm an istinus, right? And that's the reason why I don't want to touch my food. Did you ever see a guy eating a slice of pizza with a fork and knife? Yeah, that's the type of guy that Rav was. That was Rav. In other words, most of us eat a slice of pizza in our hands, but Rav didn't want to touch the food that he was eating. He washed, but also he wrapped his hands in cloth. Now, Kisolek Reb Zera Ashkechinu LeRebbi Ami VeRebbi Asi Deka'achli Bevaloi Chamasas. So Reb Zera made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, and he discovered once that the two Israeli Amoraim, Rebbe Ami and Rebbe Asi, were eating bread with flasks, worn-out flasks were wrapped around their hands. So once again, this is an indication that it's okay. Omar Trei Gavri Ravervi Kavasaichu Litoi B'Deravu Shmuel Hadaiti Katzra Ka Omar. So Reb Zera admonished them. He says, how could two great rabbis like yourselves make an error of this kind? After all, what are you relying on? The fact that Rav also wrapped his hands before eating a sandwich? The story was that he had washed in that case. As he said, I'm an istinus, I'm fastidious. So normally, what you can infer from that story is that if you're not if you didn't wash, then you can't wrap your hands. It's not going to work. So ishtamitse ha da amar Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi Omar Shmuel hitiru mapa la'ochle truma v'lo hitiru mapa la'ochle taharos v'Rebbi Ami v'Rebbi Asi kohanim havu. So Reb Zera, however, made a mistake by admonishing these rabbis, because in reality was a statement made by Rav Tachlifa in the name of Shmuel, that even though Shmuel and Rav held that you had to wash all the time and you couldn't wrap your hands, but they made an exception if you were a Kohen. If you're a Kohen, then we know that Kohanim are extremely careful because they're always handling Truma. And therefore, maybe for a regular Yisrael who wants just to eat his food in a state of purity, we have to worry that if we allow him to wrap his hands, maybe the wrapping will come undone and he'll inadvertently touch the food without having washed. But because we're dealing with Kohanim, and Rebbe Ami and Rebbe Asi themselves were Kohanim, they felt justified to permit themselves to wrap their hands because Kohanim are very, very careful. Kohanim's rizimim. They're very, very careful about how they handle their food, and therefore there's a special dispensation for Kohanim. Now, it sounds like at this point that the Gemara is maintaining that wrapping your hands is not okay. And we know in halacha that lichatchila you shouldn't rely on this, but b'shas hadechak, in a dire situation where water is not available, then you can rely on it. Now, ibayeluhu. Now here's another interesting question. Oichel machmas ma'achil tzorich netilas yadayim olo. Let's say you're a very wealthy retired person, and you're so wealthy that you can't be bothered to eat yourself. So you want someone to feed you. You know, like, or
you're ill.
Or you're ill and you could be in the hospital and someone is feeding you, right? In the case of you're ill, right, so, you know, there are a lot of considerations why you should be patur. But the question is like this.
What if you're not ill?
Do you need to do netilas yadayim if you're not handling the food, but someone is just shtupping the food in your mouth? That's the shaila. Someone's feeding you a sandwich, feeding you pieces of bread, you know, like peel me a grape, you know, that image, right? So give me some bread. You're not touching the bread. Do you have to wash or not? So tashma. Now there could be a concern that even though someone's feeding you, you may be tempted to help them and touch your mouth or whatever. So the Rav Huna bar Schora havakoi kamei de Rav Hamnuna bolam lei umtza va'achil. Listen to the following story. Rav Huna was standing in front of Rav Hamnuna, sticking pieces of meat into his mouth, and Rav Hamnuna was eating. Amar lei ilavda Rav Hamnuna at lo safino lach. So, and he said, if it were not for the fact that you were Rav Hamnuna, I would not be feeding you. So my time alav mishum desire velo naga. So doesn't that imply that he knew that Rav Hamnuna would be careful and not touch the food before putting it in his mouth. So doesn't that imply that as long as you're careful, you don't have to wash as long as someone else is feeding you?
In the story, it didn't say he didn't wash, but I guess he didn't.
Well, we're making a lot of assumptions in the story. Like, why would Rav Schora say that? So the Gemara says, Lo, dezariz kadim umashim yadei meikar. No, that's not what the inference is. What the inference is that maybe you're not allowed to eat without washing, even when someone's feeding you.
He did wash.
But he says, if it weren't for the fact that you're Rav Hamnuna and I know that you washed, then I wouldn't have fed you.
Could it be also, if it isn't necessary to wash in this situation, also couldn't it be a bracha?
Well, we're not dealing with a bracha. Remember, Netilas Yadayim may be required even if you're not making a bracha. Nowhere has the Gemara discussed the bracha on Netilas Yadayim. Okay? So, Tashma, Do Amar Rebbe Zera, Amar Rav, Lo Yitein Adam Prusa L'soch Piv Shel Shamash, Eli Imken Yodea Bo Shenat Al Yadav. So let's look at the following statement. Rebbe Zera said in the name of Rav that when you have a waiter who's working, a lot of times these waiters, part of the fringe benefit of being a waiter is you get to nosh while you're serving, or in between while you're serving the people that are dining, right? So let's say the guy's got trays of stuff and he's carrying it around and he says, here, stick something in my mouth. So I'm hungry. So you're not allowed to stick a piece of bread in the waiter's mouth unless you know that he washed his hands. So that seems certainly to imply that you need to wash even in this case. And the next thing
the word is interesting, shamash. It's from the Hanukkah.
Yeah.
It means waiter.
A waiter or an attendant.
Yeah.
That's what a shamash is, right?
I'm saying that's where you get the shamash in the shul. Right?
Of course, yeah. V'hashamish mevarich al kol kos v'kos, ve'ena mevarich al kol prusa uprusa. And furthermore, the shamish, the waiter, if he's offered a new glass of wine, he has to make a bracha on every new glass of wine. And why is that? Because wine is not something that a waiter can automatically expect that they're going to give him. Wine is expensive. So if there's leftover wine, so they may offer him. But it's not something that he anticipates. Just because I had wine 10 minutes ago, I can assume that I'm going to drink more. So since it's not anticipated, he's got to make a new bracha on every glass that he's offered. But when it comes to bread, you can assume that there'll always be a little bit of leftover bread. And so therefore, if you already made hamotzi once, you don't have to make hamotzi a second time when they offer you a second slice of bread. Rabbi Yochanan Omar mevarech al kol prusa uprusa. And Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and he says, even bread, you have to make a new bracha because you can't assume that you're going to get more. Va'amar Rav Papa bishlam adarav v'Rabbi Yochanan lo kasha hadiika adam chashav hadaleka adam chashav. So Rav Papa says, I can certainly understand how we can reconcile the difference between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, where one says on each piece of bread you have to make a new hamotzi, and the other one says that you don't. Because it could be they're talking about two different scenarios, where one is an Adam Chashuv, an important, wealthy man, where it's reasonable to assume that there'll always be leftover bread, and therefore you only have to make one hamotzi and not on any additional pieces of bread. And the other case where you have to make hamotzi on each piece of bread is where the person is not so wealthy, where there may not be leftover bread. But mikol makom haka'amar eli im ken yodea shenat al yadav. But one thing we can infer is that it says explicitly that the shamash has to wash before you're allowed to put bread in his mouth. So doesn't that prove that even though a person is being fed by someone else, he still has to wash? So the Gemara says no. Shiny shamash detarid. It could be that a waiter is different from a regular person, because since a waiter is in the middle of his work shift, and he's schlepping, carrying things all back and forth, and he's constantly being harangued by the customers and so forth, maybe he's not going to be careful, and when someone puts a piece of bread in his mouth, he may be tempted to touch it, and he won't be mentally in the moment to remind himself not to touch the bread. But it could be that a regular person who's not in the middle of his work moment, we could entrust him to say that you don't have to wash as long as someone else is feeding you, and you'll be careful. So that you can't bring a raya from a waiter. Tanu Rabbanan. Let's look at another brisa. Lo yitein adam prusa l'shamish bein shahakos biyado, bein shahakos biyado shel balabayis, shema ye'ored devar kalkola b'su'uda. So the first thing the brisa says is that if I'm a guest in your house, I don't have permission to take a piece of bread from the table and stick it into the mouth of the waiter. Why is that? And it makes no difference whether the balabayas is holding a cup of wine or whether the waiter is holding a cup of wine. I don't have permission to do that because a couple of things might happen. Let's say the balabas is not used to feeding his waiter during the meal because he wants to save every piece of bread for his guests. He might get upset, he might get out of sorts, and he'll spill the wine that's in his cup. That's the kalkala, that's the disgraceful thing that might take place, is that someone will spill their wine out of nervousness or out of being startled. And the waiter also, you stick a piece of bread in his mouth, he's not used to that, and he may get startled and spill the wine also. So if you're a guest, don't start feeding the waiter. That's the rule. Name of a new movie, don't feed the waiter. Anyway, v'hashamesh shelo natal yadav asur litein prusa l'soch piv. And if a waiter did not wash, you can't even the balabas cannot put a piece of bread in his mouth. So that's all the Brisa says. And again, we're left hanging whether if that's only by a shamish or whether that's by a regular person too. Even though we haven't answered our initial question, but we're going on to the next question. And the next question is, okay, what about the feeder? The guy who's taking the piece of bread and sticking it into my mouth, does he have to wash? Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, he's not eating. But on the other hand, he's handling my food. So maybe he has to wash his hands. So Tashma, the Tani Devei Menashe, Reb Shimon Gamliel Oimer, Isha Madicha Es Yada Echas B'mayim V'nosenes Pas Livna Kata. So the Brisa, which quotes Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, says that if it's Yom Kippur, and we know that you're not supposed to wash your hands on Yom Kippur, you're not supposed to bathe at all on Yom Kippur, but a woman is allowed to wash the hand that she's going to use to feed her child on Yom Kippur, because the child can eat, and you have to be able to, and she's got to have a clean hand when she handles the food, so she washes that hand. So that seems to imply that you do need to netilas yadayim if you're feeding someone else food. And then the Brisa continues and it says, Amru alav al shamai hazaken, shelo ratza lahachil biyado echas, v'gazru alav sheyachil b'shtei yadav. That Shammai Hazaken was so meticulous and so careful about Yom Kippur that he was resistant to washing his hand before feeding his child, and he just basically didn't feed his child. And when the rabbis got wind of this, they say, you can't starve a child on Yom Kippur just because you're so machmir. That's harmful to a child's life. And therefore they made a special decree, not only do you have to wash one hand, but we're gozer that you have to wash two hands. To make sure that people like you have to bend over backwards to make sure that you wash your hands so that the child will get fed on Yom Kippur. So basically what the Gemara is saying is that you can infer from here that if you're a feeder, you have to wash even though you're not eating. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Amar Abaye Hasa Mishum Shivta. It could be that in that instance, because the practice was back then that on Yom Kippur morning when you got up, you didn't wash Netilas Yadayim at all. And it could be because there's still a ruach ra, an evil spirit lingering on the fingers because you didn't do nagel vaser. That's the reason why it's necessary to wash before you feed the child the food, because that metaphysical evil spirit that lingers on the fingers from the morning, from after you've slept, will be imparted into the food, and that will be injurious to the eater. But let's say you wash nagel vaser because it's not Yom Kippur. We cannot infer from this story that you're required to wash your hands before you feed someone else food. So that's not necessarily a raya. Tashma, de'avua d'Shmuel ashkeche l'Shmuel de'kabachi. Let's look at another story, very interesting story. Shmuel's father once found his son Shmuel crying. Apparently he was a younger person. So Amar lei amai kabachis. So he said, Shmuel, my zisa. So my tirela. He says,
Called him Shmulik.
Shmulik, why are you crying? What's the matter? So, Demachyan Raboy, he says, because my Rebbe gave me a zetz.
Oh.
That'll do it, right? Well, if that doesn't happen anymore, but in the old days it used to happen. Yeah. So Amai. So his father said, why did he zetz you? Da Amar li kasafis libroi velo mashis yadecha. So because my Rebbe said to me, you gave my son a piece of bread and you didn't wash your hands. So he gave me a zetz because I didn't wash my hands before I gave his son a piece of bread.
They're in the same class.
Maybe. So,
I had one of those.
Va'amai mashes. So Shmuel's father said, well, why didn't you wash your hands? So Amar lei hu achil va'ana mashina. So Shmuel said, why should I have to wash if I'm not eating? He's the one who's eating. So Amar lei lo mistaya de lo gomir mimchanami machi. So Shmuel's father became indignant, and he said, it's bad enough that your Rebbe is an ignoramus.
Oh boy.
Right? He's going to hit you for his own ignorance.
He's messing with the wrong kid.
messing with the wrong kid. That's right. So v'hilchasa, that's what I would say. V'hilchasa oichel machmas machil tzarech netilas yadayim machil eno tzarech netilas yadayim. And the final upshot says the Gemara that if you're eating, even though someone's feeding you, you still have to wash, lest you come and touch the food. That's
the guy eating.
The guy eating,
Yeah.
but the feeder does not have to wash his hands.
Like that?
I believe so. Yeah.
But why are they always using children who aren't don't have a chiyav? I mean, if they're under Berber.
I don't know. No, who says we're talking about underage children?
Oh, I see. These could be boys.
And even if it is an underage child,
just a story.
Shmuel was being slapped because he may have been in bar mitzvah. You know. So the Gemara. Now let's look at the next Mishnah. New subject. Tzorer Adam Basar Ugvina b'matfachas echas uvovad shelo zebazeh. A person is allowed to take a piece of meat and a piece of cheese and wrap them in the same satchel, provided that they don't touch each other directly. There has to be some kind of cloth partition between the two in the satchel to divide them. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Shnei achsenoin ochlen al shulchan echad zeh basar v'zeh gevina ve'ein choshen. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says a separate halacha, that if two people come to an inn and they want to sit at the same table and they're both brown bagging it, one has milchiks and one has fleischiks, no problem. They can sit at the same table. So the Gemara now says, let's go back to the first halacha. Why do you need to have a separation between the meat and the cheese in the same satchel? If they're both cold, what's the big deal even if they're touching? So Amar Abaya Nehida Klipa Loboy Hadacha Miloboy. So Abaya says, well, you're right. When there's no heat, there's no transfer of flavor into the substance of the food. But at least there's surface moisture, there's surface fat on both the cheese and the meat. And you would have to rinse that off. So in order to lechatchila, you're not allowed to do that, to create a situation where you'd have to rinse off the items. So therefore, you have to create a separation. Now, let's go to the next halacha. Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer Shnei Achsonan Ochlan Al Shulchan V'chulei. Amar Rav Chanan Bar Ami Omar Shmuel Lo Shana Elo Shein Makirin Zeh Ezeh. Avol Makirin Zeh Ezeh Aser. So Rav Chanan says in the name of Shmuel that that's only true that they can dine at the same table if they don't know each other. They're not acquainted. But if they're acquainted, then they may be tempted to share food, and therefore they cannot dine at the same table. I got my mac and cheese, you got your chullin, and we may. Oh, that looks really good. Can I taste some? So you want to avoid that if they're friendly with each other, and therefore you can't do it. Tanya Nami Hachi Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer. Beizach Sanoim Shenis Archu Lepundak Echad Zeba Min Hatzafon VeZeba Min Hadarom Zeba B'Chasicha So VeZeba B'Gevina So Ochlen Al Shulchan Echad Zeba Sar VeZe Gavina Ve'Ein Choshishin. If you look at the illustration in the Brisa, it says two guests come to an inn. One comes from the north and one comes from the south. So that implies that geographically they don't know each other, right? They're from two separate places. Only then do we say that one can sit down with his piece of meat, one can sit down with his piece of cheese, and they can eat at the same table. V'lo asru ela b'tefisa echas, and they only prohibit when it's in one bunch, meaning that the meat and the meat and the cheese are in one bunch. So the Gemara says tefisa echas al kedaitach. What do you mean if the meat and the cheese are in one bunch? Forget about at the same table. You can't eat those two things if they're bunched together. Ela ke'ein tefisa echas, but what it means is that they can't mamish be like tfisa echas. They can't be in one group. In other words, so there's a number of ways to understand what that means, but the way that Rabbeinu Gershom explains it is that they can't recognize each other. They can't be part of the same group bunched together. And as long as they're not bunched together, then it's okay because they don't know each other. So Amalei Rav Yemar Bar Shalmi Alabaya. Shnei achenu makpidin ze el ze mahu. Now here's an interesting question. Two brothers know each other very well, but they can't stand each other. They had a business, they got into a fight, they don't talk to each other, and they get seated at the same table at the inn. They go to the same Pesach program. They go to the same Pesach program in Miami, and now they're sitting down to eat at the dining room table, and one's got his milchiks and one's got his fleischiks. Is that okay? On the one hand, they know each other, but on the other hand, they're not going to be tempted to share the food because they're not talking to each other. They don't like each other. So what's the halacha? So Amar Le, Yomer Kol Hasriken Asur Nasrike Baitus Mutarin. So this is using a parable to answer the question. And what the parable is based on the laws of Pesach. There's in Maseches Psachim it says that when you bake matzah, you can't have any fancy designs or illustrations in the matzah. Why is it? Because the women who bake the matzah, they're going to want to make fancy designs, and it's going to take them a long time, and the dough will become chametz. So they made an across-the-board decree that you can't make any designs in the matzah before you bake it. Like today, like today when we make challah, so women will, make designs, braids, no designs, no schlissel matzah. You can't do any of that stuff, okay? Right? But there was a guy in the neighborhood where this shaila came up, and his name was Baitos, and he was a baker. And he had a mold. All he would do is he'd take the matzah dough, and he would stamp it with the mold, and all of a sudden it would have a beautiful design. And it took all of a half a second to do that. So there's no concern that it's going to become chametz while you're doing that. So what about that? Would that be mutter? And so the psak over there was no, because people are not going to know how to distinguish. When they see Baitus's matzahs, they're going to think that he spent a few minutes designing it by hand. And people will think that that's okay. So in order to avoid that confusion, they make an across-the-board rule. So the suggestion is the same thing should happen over here. You got two brothers sitting at the table. Maybe someone doesn't know that they don't like each other. They're not talking. And they're going to infer that if two brothers can sit together, even though they know each other, and they can still eat their fleischiks and the milchiks together, then anyone can do it. It's a marasayin or it's a low plug, however you want to say it. So the Gemara says, "V'li taimei chada amar Rebbe Asi amar Rebbe Yochanan." Mi she'en lo ela chalok echad mutar lechabsu b'cholo shel moed yomer kol asriken asur nesrike baitus mutarin. So the Gemara says, well, then let me ask you a question. Why don't you say the same argument when it comes to the laws of chol hamoed? We know that on chol hamoed you're not allowed to do laundry. We all know that halacha, right? But there's one exception. What's the exception? If you only have one tunic, you only have, in those days they wore tunics, long shirts, right? What if I only have one shirt and it gets soiled? So then the rabbis made an exception. They said if it's for Chol HaMoed and you only have one shirt, you're allowed to wash it on Chol HaMoed. But why don't we say, people are going to see the guy doing it, Marasign, they're going to see him, they're going to see him doing the laundry, and they're going to say, oh, it's okay to do laundry on Chol HaMoed. The same thing with the matzahs, right? So the Gemara says, Ha'amar mar bar Rav Ashi ezuro mochiach olav. So the answer is that because the common practice in those days was that your tunic had loops in it to put in your belt, okay? And you put in your belt, and then when it was time to wash your tunic, you would take off your belt, throw the tunic into the wash, and put the belt in the new tunic that you were going to put on in its stead. The thing is that if you only have one tunic, though, there's no reason to take off the belt and put it on the other tunic because you don't have another tunic. So you would put the belt and we're not talking about a leather belt, we're talking about like a cloth belt. You would keep it in the wash with the tunic.
It should be clean.
So there, when people see the guy washing his tunic, they're going to see the belt attached to it, and they're going to know that this is an exceptional situation because he's only got one tunic.
Otherwise his belt wouldn't be attached.
Okay, so that's the reason why. We'll hold it here for today. Have a wonderful day.